I will surrender my position as Empress. Chapter 10. Junction Conference Hall Assembly. From AudiNovel. Mrs. Giggs carefully examined the gold ingot handed to her by the Empress. I'll check out the dress and pay for it, but can I use one of these gold ingots without leaving a balance? She inquired, wanting to give the impression that the Empress was generous. I brought it for that purpose, so don't leave it behind, and use it. All right. The Empress, in a calm tone, drank cold water to soothe her stomach and asked, how can this happen? I don't believe there is any budget for the Empress Palace. Is there no budget for the Empress Palace? The Imperial Palace of Echmont prepares the budget for the next year at the end of the year, but as Her Majesty was not present the previous year, the budget was probably not prepared. Mrs. Giggs explained. So, you mean this is normal? Of course not. Mrs. Giggs replied. It's possible to rearrange the budget as much as possible through the emergency supplementary budget system. The problem is that the authority regarding supplementary budgets lies solely with His Majesty the Emperor. At that moment, the maid announced the arrival of the clothing store owner, and Adele and Mrs. Giggs stood up at the same time. The Empress gently patted Mrs. Giggs on the shoulder with a courteous smile. Take good care of it. Don't worry. But Your Majesty the Empress, where are you going? The Empress laughed mischievously. It was a smile that seemed to make even the elderly, who had experienced everything from prenatal battles to aerial battles, feel a chill. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Don't worry, we'll see each other later. Let them stay tonight in my palace. The Empress winked and whispered a smile, then walked away. Mrs. Giggs stared at the black hair blowing in the wind for a long time, as if enchanted. Mrs. Giggs was absorbed for a long time until the lady-in-waiting approached and called her by name. After regaining her senses, she smiled a bit and lifted her lips. Let me guide you. Of course. Please follow me. Adele headed straight to the Emperor's palace, the place that housed both the Emperor's bedroom and the main meeting room for the administration of state affairs. In comparison to the splendid palace of the Empress, this space proved to be more modest and functional. As Adele walked through the palace, she saw groups of 3 and 5 people gathered in front of the Imperial Palace, dressed in various uniforms, as if they were in the midst of a ministerial meeting. They hurriedly corrected their postures at the sudden appearance of the Empress, respectfully bowing their heads as Adele gracefully moved among them. Is there a meeting going on? Adele asked as they crossed the main gate, and the porter politely confirmed that there was. As soon as the attendants learned of the Empress's visit, they rushed out to greet her. Adele explained the reason for her visit. I wish to have an audience with His Majesty the Emperor. She said. Yes. Your Majesty the Empress. The attendant replied. If you wait in the drawing room for a while, I will inquire of Your Majesty and provide you with a response. Drawing area. The Empress asked. Yes. The attendant replied. The Empress nodded, then narrowed her eyes, tilting her head in curiosity about what Adele was thinking. Isn't there a waiting room at the Central News Conference? Of course, there is a waiting room, but it isn't as comfortable as the drawing room, to which we will direct you. It doesn't matter, the Empress said. I would also like to see the meeting place of the high officials in Echmont, so please guide me there, the Empress ordered in a firm tone, as if not allowing any objections, and the attendants had no choice but to obey her orders. Around that time, in the Junction Conference Hall was nearby. The Emperor sat in the seat of honor with a bored expression, scribbling on the documents in front of him. Duke Despun, who sat to the Emperor's right, stretched his neck and looked at the papers in front of him. Unable to discern the document's content, he furrowed his brow, shifted his gaze, and locked eyes with the man staring at me from the other side. His gaze met the man on the other side of him, Theseus Balder, a young servant who wears glasses and is 29 this year. He is the head of the Balder family, who owns a vast territory. Despite his youth, he was considered the best Duke of Balder. When Theseus caught Duke Despon's gaze, he naturally turned to face his brother, Lionel Balder, who had turned 27 this year. Lionel Balder, the younger brother of the Duke, was a natural-born soldier, currently holding the position of Chief of the Imperial Guard and Minister of Defense of Echmont. The knights called him Captain, and high-ranking officials referred to him as Minister of Defense. Duke Despon glanced at the Balder brothers in turn and moistened his lips. He wishes he could have a son like them. He would have cherished and loved his son if they had been similar. Well, since they were the sons of the late Duke of Balder, it would have been difficult for them to share the same thoughts as him. It was when Duke Despon looked at the Balder brothers and lost himself in his thoughts. Suddenly, a man's scream interrupted his thoughts. "Your Majesty, please send us strikers, offensive mages. They can directly attack the core of the tower, and guardians, defensive mages. They slow down the tower's growth or descent to the ground. Everyone is dying. They are dying right now." Duke Despon was annoyed by the man's cries and whines, like a child. He turned his head away with a click of his tongue. "No matter how hard we try, it keeps coming out. Now even flying monsters are appearing, and there's no way to stop them. Unless the striker and keeper take down the tower. Well, do you know where we're hanging out?" It was Lennox Poitiers, seated to the right of Duke Despon, who broke the wailing appeal. "Even those who have first and second level towers built in their territory aren't saying anything at this moment, right? However, now, what's been built in the Calvin County is only a 4th grade tower. Didn't you say it's gotten bigger in diameter? Flying monsters have even appeared. It's not the 4th grade. How can you refuse? It says in the document that it's the 4th grade, but where do you say it's not?" While Lennox cried out in frustration, Count Calvin swallowed his anger, jumped from his seat, and kneeled before the Emperor as Lennox cried out in blood. "Honorable His Majesty the Emperor. Please help us. Your Majesty, you are a very selfish person." For the time being, Calvin beat the knights and keep them at bay. Kneeling Count Calvin clenched his fists and glanced at Lennox when a low voice interrupted him. "Because the manner is deteriorating, those who appeal are self-centered." Lennox and Count Calvin's gazes turned to the same place at the same time. "Isn't that right? It would be a disaster if a medium to large tower with a flying monster was built on the property. Seriously, would the Lord of the Lord come to this place and ask for assistance? You are self-centered. Bag-Poitiers, please stop arguing." Duke Balder warned Lennox. Lennox paused for a moment, then snorted. When he openly laughed at Duke Balder's words, some nobles rebelled and erupted in anger. "Head of Gonga Balder, do your best, Bag-Poitiers. How dare you snort?" As the nobles revolted, Lennox Poitiers raised his eyes fiercely and shrugged. Despite being a commoner, he was clearly a striker of exceptional skill, having attained the position of the inheritable count. He did not, however, dare to compete with Duke Balder. Nonetheless, he was arrogant and trusted the Duke of Devonshire and Diane Poitiers. "Did I say something wrong? Isn't that right, Your Majesty?" When Lennox tilted his head to the Emperor and asked, the attention of the nobles focused on the Emperor. Karl, who was observing the situation with her chin resting on her hand, looked at the Balder brothers sitting with stern expressions. The two stared fixedly at the edge of the table, mouths tightly shut. "I bet the vice-captain of the magic division won't speak nonsense." At this, Count Poitiers curled his lips, smiled, and nodded. "Bag Calvin. Your Majesty, yes. I apologize, Your Grace. Would you please? Your Majesty, please Count." Many of your majesty's subjects are dying right now. Tears welled up in Count Calvin's eyes. While tears of mercy moistened his neck, Lennox Poitiers shook his head and muttered. What did you say now, Lennox Poitiers? It was natural for Count Calvin's anger to explode. As his shouts echoed in the conference room, Lennox Poitiers jumped up and shouted. Did I say something wrong? What? The conference hall quickly descended into chaos. Lionel and Theseus leaned back in their chairs, staring at Lennox and then at the Emperor at the same time. The Emperor was staring at Count Calvin with a frown on his face as if he had no intention of intervening. Bag Poitiers, that's enough. It was Duke Despun, unable to bear his shrill voice, who stopped Lennox. Lennox immediately responded to his moderation. Yes, Your Highness the Duke. With his red-stained face, Count Calvin, on the other hand, was unable to contain his rage. The air in the meeting room was like thin ice that could break at any moment. A stifling silence descended. After observing the situation for a while, Lionel let out a deep sigh and broke the silence. Your Majesty, if a flying monster appears in Count Calvin's territory, it is proper to support the wizard first. It's not that there's no manpower, aren't there wizards residing in the Imperial Palace? Upon hearing this, Lennox immediately objected to this. Do you realize we play and eat? Subsequently, several nobles who had been silent until now jumped from their seats and exclaimed. What is the point of having a group of magicians? Why do you stay alone in the Imperial Palace instead of going to the places that really need assistance? What if a Class 1 tower fell in the Imperial Palace while we're heading to destroy a Class 4 tower? As the argument was about to erupt again, the Emperor, tired of the meeting itself, slammed the table. Stop. There will be no conclusion. The Emperor sank into a chair, expressing his intention to end today's meeting at this point. Many people protested because the atmosphere could not be finished, but the Duke of Despun and the Count of Poitiers actively sympathized and stood up. When they stood up, the meeting turned into a wave-like atmosphere. Lionel and Theseus looked at Count Calvin with stern expressions. He was staring into space with a pale face. This meeting was his last hope. At that moment, an assistant approached the Emperor and handed him a message. Your Majesty, the Empress is waiting for you. The Empress. High-ranking officials preparing to leave hesitated, glancing at the Emperor and his assistants. Yes. She's waiting for you to finish the meeting in the conference hall's waiting room. Where do you want to go? Karl, who frowned at those words, sat in his chair and placed his order. Do you want to go far? Bring her here when the high-ranking officials leave. Lennox Poitiers, who had been closely watching his reaction, smiled and lifted his lips. Meanwhile, in the middle of the senior officials' meeting, the Empress stood up in her waiting room outside the meeting room, her ears perking up. She appeared to be paying attention to what was being said, pausing her movements and concentrating on the voices. Meanwhile, when the voices of high-ranking officials reached the waiting room through the massive door, the two attendants guarding the room looked at the Empress with embarrassed expressions. As expected, the Empress frowned upon hearing the loud voice. Who was it that just shouted? I believe it was the Count of Lennox Poitiers. The Empress nodded and returned her attention to the sound beyond the door. How long have they been like this? The sound of someone pushing the chair was audible. As soon as the meeting appeared to be over, the Empress sat back on the sofa, as if she had never done so before. She then leaned back slightly and stared arrogantly at the door of the Junction Conference Hall after lifting the untouched teacup. It took a shift in attitude for the people watching to open their mouths. When the heavy door finally opened, the lieutenants began to rush out. Because the Zhongshan meeting hall's structure required to exit outside through the waiting room, so the high-ranking officials had no choice but to make eye contact with the Empress. The high-ranking officials, upon encountering the Empress, hastily greeted her. As soon as the meeting seemed to end, the Empress reclined on the sofa with a relaxed attitude, as if she had never done so before. Then, after lifting the untouched teacup, she slightly tilted her head back and looked towards the conference room door with an arrogant expression. Adele, who was having difficulty receiving greetings due to the large crowd, nodded lightly as she set down her teacup. And she thought, "Shall we stand gracefully and greet?" It was a moment to do so. Woman. Adele became suspicious of her ears after receiving a ridiculous call. Hi. Want more? From AudiNovel. Subscribe for more.